welcome to another Hayley-Roxanna crafts video. In my last video I gave you 6 reasons for why you want to keep the back of your cross stitching as neat as you possibly can. So in this video I'm going to give you 5 tips on how you can do that. My first tip is to make the crosses the same way each time as much as possible. So on this piece of Ada I have done 2 sets of crosses which at first glance look exactly the same. But this set of crosses I did by doing all the bottom stitches going in this direction first, so from bottom left to top right, all across that row, and then came back and crossed back bottom right to top left, and then repeated that on the next row, then the next row, and then the bottom one. Whereas with this set here, I just randomly stitch crosses wherever to get the same shape, but with no sort of regular way of doing it. So if I turn them over and look on the back, this is the back of the first set of crosses where I've stitched all one way and then back, and then this is the one where I've done it randomly. So clearly this version is neater, the first version. Whereas this is a bit messy. Doing it this way can also lead to sort of a build up of thread in certain areas if you keep crossing over the same bit, which can just make the back a bit bulky. This would also be a lot harder to undo, as I wouldn't know where I've stitched. A bit harder to work it out, whereas this, because I know exactly how I stitched it, it's really easy to undo. And also keeping the crosses the same way makes the front neater, because if you look carefully in this one, I actually did, I'm going to focus, this cross here is actually done back to front. It's a bit hard to see, but the bottom layer of this one is facing this way and the top is that way, which is different to all the other stitches. And if you do that a few times, it can then lead to the front looking messy. Now obviously there are occasions where it's not possible to stitch bottom left to top right all the way across and then back again and then do the same on the next row. There might be reasons why you can't go through a certain hole. It might be the hole that you've just been through, so therefore you'd be undoing your stitch if you went through it. So in these cases it is okay to do it slightly different as long as the crosses on the front still look the same. And if you're only doing that occasionally, the back will still look as neat as you can possibly get it. My second tip is to not travel thread too far between stitches. So travelling thread is where you're moving from one area of stitches to another and you're missing out some of the squares in between the 2 sets or more of stitches. Okay, so on here I've got 2 different ones. I've got some in pink and some in black. So if you look on the back, you can see here I've travelled from these first few stitches across these 2 squares to do these. And on the black here I've done this row and then I've travelled to this row and then travelled again to this. So it's literally just trailing the thread in between the different areas of where you're stitching. Travelling thread can lead to the back becoming bulky. You can end up with areas where you've got lots of travelling thread crossing, and that can just make it harder to find the holes in the fabric when you're stitching. As a general rule, when I'm stitching, I don't tend to go over or skip more than 4 squares in one go. It does depend on how many times I need to travel over that bit. So for instance with the pink here, I did these 5 stitches, missed 2, and then did the 2 there with just the bottom stitches and then travelled back, so I crossed here twice. Whereas with these black stitches I did these 3 one way and back, and then moved down to do these and back, and then down to do these and back, so I was only crossing over the squares the once. If I'm only crossing once, I could probably go up to the 4. If I'm crossing it more than once, I probably don't want to go over more than 2 or skip more than 2 squares. You also need to consider when you are using a thread that is much darker than the fabric how many you go over, because if you can see on this black, you can just about faintly, if I move my hand, you can sort of faintly see the black showing through here where I've travelled the thread. Whereas on the pink, it's much less obvious as it's a much lighter colour. It's much closer to the colour of the fabric. So you may not want to travel a darker thread quite as far as you'd be travelling the lighter threads, as you wouldn't necessarily want it showing through. It would depend on whether you were going to be putting crosses in these squares, because if you are going to be putting stitches into these squares, probably doesn't matter quite so much as it will be a bit more hidden. But if you're not, that may not look quite as good on your finished piece because you can see the black thread through the white fabric. My third tip is to keep an eye out for twists and knots in the thread as you are stitching. Sometimes as you're stitching, your thread can sort of twist or get knots in it just from the motions of taking it through the fabric. This can then cause you to not be able to pull your thread through your fabric properly, which can make loops appear on the back in the thread, and then these can get caught in other stitches, and it can just make some of the areas on the back of your work a bit lumpy, a bit bulky, which can then lead to issues with you finding the holes to do other stitches. One way to prevent this is to try not to use a piece of thread that's too long. I usually use approximately 50 centimetres of thread when I'm starting off. It does depend on the type of thread I'm using. Certain makes can be a little bit more easy to sort of get twisted or knotted, so you might want to use a slightly shorter thread in those, and even certain colours are more prone to twisting and knotting. And also how many strands you're using. I find if I'm using just one strand, I tend to get more sort of knots in my thread than when I'm using two or more. Another way to help prevent these twists and knots, which also helps to make your stitches look better as well, is just every so often, if you notice your thread starting to twist, maybe your stitches aren't sitting quite flat, just let it dangle upside down from the needle. You can even pull the excess bit, like so, just let it have a dangle, and that just helps to untwist the thread, and then you can carry on stitching, and hopefully you won't get any knots or any stitches that don't look quite right or the best they can be. My fourth tip is, if you are using more than one colour of thread at a time, keep any unused threads on the front of your work. So you may be using more than one thread at a time if maybe you use the parking method of stitching, which is where you keep threads attached to your work, even if you're not using that particular colour, while you stitch in a different colour, so you may have a few threads attached. You could also find that you have more than one colour in use if you realise you've missed a stitch in a colour that you thought you'd finished with, and you want to do that missing stitch before you forget about it, but you don't really want to finish off the colour that you are currently using. So for example, if I was using this pink and I'm doing this stitch, and then I suddenly realise, oh, I needed to do a black one, I've missed the black one out, I would just make sure that my pink thread is on the front of my work before I stitch this back one in. That way you can make sure that the thread is out of the way. So if I've pulled the needle off so I can stitch up the black, when you're stitching you can make sure that the thread is away from where you want to stitch. So if I was going to be putting the black in, say here, I can just make sure that this is up here out of the way, or if it needed to go in above, I can make sure it's below where I'm working, just so that you don't catch it. You're less likely to catch it in your work if it's on the front than if you leave it at the back, and then as you're stitching you can't see where that excess thread is, and you might stitch over it, and then you can end up with loops and bumpy bits and that bulkiness on the back, which just makes it much harder to work with, and can leave your work looking a bit untidy. You can also catch the thread and sort of pull it through with the other colour as well if you're not careful, or part of it. So yeah, if you're using more than one thread at a time, just keep any excess thread on the front of the work so that you can see where it is, so you don't go and accidentally stitch it in on the back. And my 5th tip for keeping the back of your work neat is to make sure that you cut off any excess thread when you've finished with it. Right, so when you've finished doing the stitches that you need to do in a particular colour, and if you don't want to use that thread again, so even if you're using the parking method, this would be relevant. If you've actually finished with that thread and you're not going to use it again at all, your best bet is to finish it off however you want to, whether it's running under some stitches or knotting it. I will do a video showing different ways of finishing off a thread, but whatever option you use, and then you want to make sure you cut off as much of the excess as you can once you've finished it off, just so that you haven't got thread floating around on the back that can get caught in other stitches. As again, this can lead to you getting bulky areas on the back, but it can also lead to the thread being pulled through to the front. So the leftover bits being pulled through to the front, and if you've got a lighter colour with a darker colour, that thread could really show up on the front of the work and ruin your finished piece, which you don't want. So yeah, best thing to do, cut off any excess thread as soon as you've finished with a colour, just to help keep your work neat on the front and the back. And that's my 5 tips on how to keep the back of your cross stitching as neat as possible. If you've got any other tips you want to share, pop them in the comments along with any questions you may have, and I will do my best to answer them. Remember, when you are cross stitching, the back of your work doesn't need to be perfect. You just want to make it as neat as you possibly can, just to make things that little bit easier for yourself and to help to keep your finished piece looking the best it can be. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!